Well, I think growing up in Zanzibar, which is in a way a concentrated cosmopolitan society.
This series of presentation is part of the Awakening Project.
And at that time, then I joined here. It was in government Indian Junior.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to Learning from Our History series of the Awakening Project of Khoja Shia International Muslim Community. In this series of presentations are conversations with various personalities whose lives have touched many of us and inspired some of us. We believe that such conversations are of immense benefits to understand our heritage and community history. Awakening Project is a grassroots-led project that looks at challenges facing the community and how our foundational institutions of family, madrasa, and member can overcome these challenges. You will find more information on the Awakening Project of Khoja Shia International Muslim Community website and various YouTube presentations. Now I have with us Arzu Merali. Assalamu alaikum, Arzu.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you, Arzu. Arzu Merali is a writer and researcher born and based in London, UK. She focuses on human rights, Islamic feminism, decoloniality, and the grammars of human dignity. She is one of the founders of Islamic Human Rights Commission and formerly an editor of the web journal Palestine Internationalist. She has an MA in English Literature via Cambridge University, postgraduate studies in law via Nottingham Trent University, and an MA in International Relations from the University of Kent. She is a co-author of Environment of Hate, The New Normal for Muslims in the UK with Saeed Riza Ameli. She currently is co-editor of the quarterly magazine The Long View with Faisal Bodi. Her work has been published in various newspapers, magazines, online publications, and journals, including Middle East Eye, The Guardian, BBC News Online, HICAT, New Internationalist, New Statements, and many others. Welcome, Arzu.
Thank you.
I can see from your bio that the focus of your work is on human rights, feminism, decoloniality, and grammars of human dignity. We will, of course, touch upon some of these subject matter during the course of our conversation. But for our viewers and myself, can you explain to us what is grammars of human dignity?
So grammars of human dignity is a phrase that has developed through thinkers and activists like Boaventura, De Sousa Santos, Enrique Dussel, and other liberation theologians and indigenous third world, developing world activists. And it's a way of talking about rights and justice, which doesn't necessarily just reproduce the language of very recent Western history. So human rights is a phrase that has a very short history and yet has become so universalized that it's unquestioned as some kind of static standard to which everybody in the whole world has to reach. Grammars of human dignity is really about broadening that conversation and saying, well, everybody has a right to decide that, have a discussion of that. There are lots of different traditions in the world. And, we should be focusing on that as a pluralistic project rather than just a dictatorial one or a didactic one. That unfortunately, and I'm saying this as someone who's worked for almost 30 years in the field of so-called human rights, NGOs and academia, etc., that has come to be associated with, to be honest, quite brutal foreign policy interventions and hypocrisy. So this is a way of, if you like, encouraging the agency of people who've been disempowered and continue to be disempowered, even supposedly by the language of human rights.
So, very simply, if I can put it very simply, would you say that the human rights language and its implementation and the way it is implemented is housed within human dignity?
I think it would like to be.
Is it a very simplified way of putting it?
No, it's not a simplified way of putting it. I think the the problems that we have in the field of human rights, whether it's as activists or in the academic world, is that those terms and even the phrase human rights has been put together by a kind of discrete group of Western intellectuals and is being implemented through institutions which are ultimately still in a kind of very colonial mode of control in terms of how they do things. And so, yes, certainly well-meaning people all over the world, including the activists and academics, myself included, who've been involved in those institutions and world, would like to think of it as a grammar of human dignity, but I think we should think of it as one of many ways of looking at human dignity and how we can work for that for everybody.
I was just wondering whether you wanted to bring out the human dignity aspect much more in the forefront in the language of human rights that we normally sort of transact our human rights businesses. Thank you very much for that. Let's begin with your childhood. As I understand it, I mean, I know it, you were born into a Khoja Shia Isna Ashari background. So talk to us about your early childhood, your school years, inspiration from mother and father, generally life in the place you were born. I take it in London. So let's begin with mother and father. I mean, did you get inspirations from mom and dad as you were growing up? Talk to us. Your childhood, your schooling and all that. Where you were born, for example?
Well, I was born in North London, I like to say. It's a double north. I literally grew up right on the edge of the Greenbelt in the days before there was something called the M25. For people who are familiar with London, they will know that this is the ring road motorway that goes around the whole of London. So albeit that I was born and brought up in London, it was a sort of semi-rural kind of city experience. People who are familiar with Tottenham Hotspur's new training ground will know that it is just literally on the edge of London and the Greenbelt, and I grew up not very far away from there. So it was both a city and both a leafy kind of countryside upbringing. Definitely, of course, mums and dads, I think even when we are not conscious of it as we are growing up, are inspirations for the vast majority of people in the world, never mind myself. I grew up in a very sort of white working class neighborhood. I wasn't really very much in contact with even people from other minoritized backgrounds. I think in a school of 400, maybe there were definitely less than 10 of us, possibly 6 or 7 of us throughout the entirety of my sort of primary schooling. And community-wise, we were not very connected. I mean, certainly, obviously, we had relatives and so on. The Khoja community at that time was relatively small compared to what it is now. And where we lived was also a bit away from where the majority of Khojas in London were. So when we did get together for things like Muharram and effectively mainly Muharram, it was with other Shia families from different, mainly Pakistani and other Indian backgrounds. So that was in the 70s and going into the 80s. So now you have a sense of my age if you cannot tell from my youthful looks. But,
yeah.
And I think it was, in some ways, that sort of environment was quite brutal because, well, that was just life in those days, but also as minoritized people in the United Kingdom, the sort of 60s, coming out of the 60s into the 70s and then the early 80s, was a brutal time if you were from a minoritized community, but also just generally there was a lot of social upheaval across the, every class pretty much, but especially.
Would you say it was shaping you as you were growing up? Quite a lot?
Inevitably. And by the time I was in my teens, I think consciously so, we knew within our school setting, in our sort of social settings, that there was a tumultuous crisis in this country.
Sorry, Arzu, yeah. Did that conflicted in your mind about your own sort of identity with the way born in United Kingdom? And then were there any support from your parents in any way, shape or form to sort of cut through the fog, if you had any, or were you very clear about it from? I mean, as you were growing up, I'm sure there must be some sort of a conflict in your mind, and share with
Yeah,
us how did that.
I think that's probably most people,
Mm,
especially those who have. I keep using the phrase minoritized as opposed to minority. That's perhaps a whole nother conversation, but I certainly think that obviously it's not even so much about you not wanting to fit in or your own issues. It's the way you're perceived then feeds into how you then perceive the rest of the world. And, we were all perceived to be different, whether by color or culture, creed, however it was phrased. And it was often a multitude of those or a combination of those, as well as gender. I think it's important to point out that women per se were not having a great time, and actually are still not having a great time. I'm very glad in the recent weeks that at least we're starting to have a conversation about this now in the United Kingdom, at least. But also at that time, that fed into any number of kind of issues that many of us had growing up. In terms of parents, I think we have to remember that they too were going through those issues as well. I mean,
I think they were going through tough times as well. Yeah.
they're going through tough times, but I think everybody at whatever level and stage is negotiating similar issues. It's just, a difference of generation, but the issues are pretty much the same. But yes, Alhamdulillah, I think I've been really blessed to have very supportive parents.
Alhamdulillah. So
Alhamdulillah,
you completed your
inspirational.
yeah. So you completed your primary and secondary education and went to Cambridge University.
That's right. Yeah.
Now this was, I think it must be in the 80s.
End of the 80s, 89.
Yeah.
I went up to.
So what was the life like there as a Muslim girl? Your first impression of your peers and colleagues, the environment, perhaps an event or two that you can remember and share with us? What was the life like there?
I think, well, where to start really? I think some of my experience in Cambridge was really determined by my own attitude, and by the age of 17, I decided to wear hijab. I'd become more interested in religion, in practicing the religion, in kind of looking at the world more critically. I think the sort of political and spiritual journeys were combined. And so I kind of went to Cambridge in a sort of, for want of a better phrase, a quite bloody-minded kind of frame of mind. This was in the wake of the Rushdie affair in the United Kingdom, which had thrown up a lot of contradictions in my sort of life. Basically, I had that by that time I did a degree in English literature, so just at the point of my own sort of academic interest, there was this sort of sudden polarization around the identity of Muslim and Muslimness and Islam. And I wasn't going to take any prisoners, so I went there thinking, well, I'm just going to go there and be as Muslim in everybody's face. And I think that probably insulated me a certain amount from some of the pressures other people go through when they go to university. And I don't mean that to detract from them or their experience. It's just that I was in a very peculiar moment. And I think a lot of my peers that I've been talking to who were in a sort of similar situation where it was kind of like we had all kind of gone into this kind of fight attitude, right? That we are going to defend ourselves from what seemed to be an endless onslaught of negativity. So it was a very sort of particular moment for that generation. But Cambridge itself, I was quite blessed. I had both very negative experiences, but also extremely good experiences, both from the establishment, the university itself, friends, peers, colleagues. And at that time, there was a very dynamic, well, in fact, there were two Islamic societies, but that's
sorry, what did you say? This?
There were two Islamic societies there at that time, of which one of which I became involved in, and which was a very kind of dynamic organization in itself. Actually has influenced my work till today, because some of the people who are involved in that are still my colleagues. One is now my husband. So, it had a lifelong impact on me. And certainly I still have connections with the university and with friends there.
So would you say that that experience, and as you were growing up, motivated you to go to human rights? I mean, the reason why I'm asking you this, Arzu, is I mean, I did medical law and ethics and human rights within the medical field. was blossoming in the 70s and the 80s, particularly mental health and all that, human rights vis-a-vis mental health. So I remember how fashionable it was for us to get interested into that emerging field. So was it a fashionable career that allowed you to pursue human rights field? Because it was something big in the 70s and
Not
80s.
particularly. It was in fact quite obscure to a lot of people, and I don't still think, even at the time that we set up Islamic Human Rights Commission, that it was a field that was easily accessible. Certainly not to people like ourselves in a westernized setting, for sure. You know, there was a lot of money being invested into human rights NGOs in other parts of the world, usually by the British government or other Western governments, ultimately with an agenda. I mean, often when you say this, people say, oh, you're paranoid, you're conspiratorial. You know, it's not a secret. It's not even necessarily a bad thing. You know, people invest money because they also want to see certain outcomes. That's just the way of the world. But unfortunately, some of those organizations do get utilized in that way. But career-wise, no. I mean, if anything, I kind of fell into it. I was actually, I did postgraduate studies in law. I was writing as a social justice journalist, basically. And I just kind of found myself not seeing a route to being a useful member of the legal establishment to kind of get the outcomes I was looking for. I'm quite ambitious, and I could see myself becoming an ambitious lawyer rather than somebody who was kind of doing good, if you like. And there are many, many good lawyers who can negotiate that system. I didn't think I could be one of those. But I just found myself writing article after article, talking about the Uyghurs, talking about, you know, racism in the UK, talking about hijab ban in France, and finding myself thinking, well, actually, it was more powerful when I was an activist. Why don't I become more involved in that? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala put me in the right place at the right time, really, to be connected with other people who had the same experiences, views, who had more experience in doing things like race relations work or NGO work, and Islamic Human Rights Commission came about as a result of those connections. And
we'll come to that in a minute. I just wanted to ask you, was it the pursuit of justice or pursuit of human rights? I mean, where was your passion?
It's justice. Justice is the both, you know, when we talk
human
about
rights is just a instrumentality.
Absolutely, it's a way to that. And as I said, sort of indicated at the beginning, I have, and also the organization has always been sitting in a kind of critical space with regard to the terminology. I mean, it's in our name. It's a little bit clumsy, but ultimately it's...
I'm coming to that. Yeah. I think let's pursue that in a minute. Sure. Let me come to that anyway, once you brought that subject up. So in 1997, you established Islamic Human Rights Commission.
Yeah.
Is that correct? 1997. So you've
97, got March 97.
Quite a number of years of experiences now to do some evaluation. So could you explain the rationale for including the term Islamic in your organization name?
So at that time, and many of us had by that time been working in one way or another in sort of broader international human rights field, despite the fact that by any accounting, about 80% of those people considered to be victims of human rights abuses worldwide were Muslim or of Muslim background. There was a perception in that kind of sector that actually, when it came to Islam itself was, if you like, a perpetrator of human rights abuses at worst, and at best, it was kind of a problematic set of ideas that people ultimately needed to be liberated from. And we were not initially going to put something particularly, you know, to talk about Islam or anything else in the name of the organization. And I think initially the first documents didn't have anything, and I was a proponent for that. But what my colleagues kind of emphasized early on, and they were right in retrospect, is that we were all Muslims who came together not just to fight for human rights according to the way they'd been dictated, but actually bringing our faith into the conversation of what justice is. You know, it was not just our inspiration, but it was also about the kind of outcomes we were looking for. So it was important to put that name in there to kind of, if you like, again, be in your face about it and say, you know, we're not embarrassed about this. This is the conversation we want to have.
Yes, but
so thus the name, which we all feel is a little bit clumsy, but at the same time, hopefully does what it says on the tin.
But can you say, then obviously a question arises, what is the difference between Islamic human rights and human rights, theoretically?
Yeah.
Aren't human rights universal, even if they're interpreted or implemented differently? I mean, this is one of the area of I wouldn't say concern, but I mean interest as to why. I mean, at the end of the day, Islamic human rights and human rights theoretically are same.
Well, the thing is,
Maybe interpreted differently, but the essence of rights. Yeah.
So, you know, okay. So I think the actual question.
I'm not doing adversarial. I'm trying to explore this thing with you. Yeah?
No.
Yeah.
I think you've put it quite well, because you said it raises a question, and that's a question that we kind of wanted to put there. We wanted to problematize. What is it that people are talking about when it comes to human rights? Because yes, in theory, it's universal, right? We all believe in justice, whoever we are, wherever we are. And it's not just about Islam versus Western human rights. You know, there are many traditions around the world and in the history of the world. Okay. Why is it that we should have a very narrow conception? And ultimately, the human rights regime we have is quite narrow. And when you actually look at the literature, it's occasionally even self-reflectively so. Okay, it came out in a certain moment post the Second World War. It was developed in stages, often clumsily, especially when you look at the issues around gender. I mean, it's quite catastrophic. You still had sort of Eleanor Roosevelt in the 50s talking about, you know, well, we're not going to talk about Black women. That's an irrelevant subject. When talking about gender justice, or, you know, things, many, many different things. Okay. So this whole conversation about what can be universal human rights is something that everybody really needs to have some purchase in. And how do we negotiate the very clear differences in people's minds about the way justice should be implemented? Okay, what do certain rights mean? Do they even exist in a certain form? And the way they have been constructed at the moment, people did not have that purchase. It was ultimately 15 people who drafted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And albeit they were from different countries, there was India, Iran, Soviet Union, you know, many places were represented. But those people were not chosen because they were representing different traditions. They were actually all very particular specialists in Western law. And even the poor chap from the Soviet Union actually got kicked out of the drafting committee because he was found out to have a post at, I think, the embassy in Washington. So it was a kind of very narrow conception that was developed. Now, it's always been our contention. We don't have a solution to this, right? We want to open the conversation. It's not about Arzu in London and her, you know, 5 or 6 or 10 or 20 colleagues, whoever's working on research, to say, well, this is what Islamic human rights should be, or this is what universal human rights should be. This is a, you know, generation or more long conversation, and it's probably something that's never going to be definitively put down. But we need to be able to work out how, as humanity, we are able to live with the differences as well as aspire to some kind of universal understanding, because, you know, ultimately the world we live in is deeply unjust. And at the same time, using the language of justice, there's a lot of injustice being perpetrated. I mean, we only have to look at things like the Iraq War, or even other, you know, interventions in the last 20, 30 years that have been dressed up as wars of liberation or human rights and have produced entirely the opposite outcomes. And I don't think it's a stretch to say that they were never really there for the good benefit of people anyway.
I mean,
so we have to be more critical about this.
Yeah, the reason why I brought this up is because, I mean, in a lot of mindset, people would say, well, what is so special about Islam?
Well,
so this is the reason why. I mean, obviously you've answered, but that was the rationale behind asking that particular question after we had.
Well, the thing is, you and I and those of us who are Islamic adherents, this is the space we need to be able to say, well, this is why we believe it's special, right? And there are much better people than myself to be able to say, this is why we believe this is the right way forward. At the same time, you know, we cannot dictate that to the rest of the world, but we are allowed to have the space in which spaces within which to say and to implement those. Okay, so it's about creating the space for the process, which at the moment there isn't. Okay, it is a case of, well, these are human rights, and anything you say to be critical of that means that you're against human rights. No, it doesn't.
So would it be better to put Muslim instead of Islamic, Muslim human rights?
No, because we're not just talking about rights for Muslims. We're talking about, you know, structural issues here. So whether we're talking about, you know, and these are also clumsy breakdowns, but things about how we discuss the environment in relation to man. Okay, if you look at the traditional human rights regime, environmental issues have only been tacked onto the end very recently. And in abstract from the relationship to humanity. Now, this is not how Islam thinks about it. It's not how many indigenous cultures also think about rights and justice. There is a, you know, no artificial separation about your rights and your duties as well to the environment. I don't mean just about, you know,
okay,
not
I think we
using
have to
plastic
move on.
straws, but
Yeah.
I mean, I'm talking about the big issues, right? So all of these things are very, very important and need to be really reimagined if we're going to save the world, frankly, never mind the individuals who are being oppressed worldwide.
Okay. Let's come to some specifics now. Given the fact that you tackle important issues pertaining to Islam and Muslims, such as Islamophobia and Zionism, what challenges has IHRC faced over the years from any critiques and generally from British society? It's a general question. Maybe I'm putting you on the spot, but
No, it's okay.
if you can, I mean, if you can remember any sort of critiques generally from, say, British society.
Well, British society, if we're talking about sort of rank and file people and so on, actually not that much criticism. I think it's in terms of criticism, happy to have criticism, happy to have conversations. It's when there have been sort of blatant attacks, misrepresentations, but also kind of attempts, not just against us, but generally to portray justice work as something unacceptable, which is actually a very kind of current trend at the moment. There have been plenty. And I mean, I can give any number of examples, but I think probably one of the most tragic is that, for example, IHRC is very involved in the Al-Quds Day marches in London. And due to kind of a very poisonous, persistent kind of set of attacks from very discrete Zionist organizations over particularly early 2017, but you know, it had been kind of bubbling for a few years. You ended up finding this kind of nexus of campaigning, is a polite way of putting it, between those organizations and some far-right groups in the United Kingdom who have been in the ascendancy for more than a decade now. And this effectively prompted Darren Osborne, unfortunately, the somewhat troubled man who drove down from Wales. And he is known, and he's gone to prison for life now for driving his van into people leaving, prayers in Finsbury Park Mosque, or actually not Finsbury Park Mosque, it was Muslim Welfare House in Finsbury Park in 2017. But he had actually driven down that day to attack Al-Quds Day. That was his motivation. This was established in the court case. But because there was a lot of police presence, he could not reach the march. He then went and sort of found another place to attack, to kill Muslims. And I think it's that sort of instrumentalization of anti-Muslim hatred, of which at that point was targeted against IHRC, Al-Quds Day, whatever, but which resulted in that, which is a sort of sad indictment of where we are in society today, not because rank and file people believe this or like this, but because there's been both a lack of leadership among civil society generally, Muslim civil society as well cannot be absolved from this, as well as political leadership that has led to this kind of environment of hate. And I use that term deliberately, being fomented, not just around Muslims as individuals or as communities, but around all sorts of issues like, for example, Palestine or racism. We're in a situation now where just calling out racism in the United Kingdom, at least, and I would argue in other parts of Europe as well, is no longer considered to be the right thing to do. If anything, you're attacked for not being grateful, not being integrated. I mean, it's almost a sort of full circle to when I was growing up. Even when my parents came to this country, a lot of the gains for social justice have been lost in the last 10, 20 years. So that is one example, but ultimately that's, if you like, the poisonous fruit of that type of attack, whether it comes from, very discrete groups, or whether it just then becomes a kind of result of a general rise in racism across society.
You did
we have the
mention
odd journalists here and there targeting us. I think we had it was about 2 years ago, the Times went for us, Andrew Norfolk. And it's one of those ironies that on the one hand, many of their journalists will quote IHRC's work as authoritative work on many issues, whether it's in the UK or overseas, and then at the same time, from their kind of editorial point of view and their opinion-led pieces, there are certain individuals, including, I guess, higher up in the editorial team, who don't like what we do and don't sort of see there's anything wrong with demonizing us.
How do you deal with those challenges then? I mean, I've mentioned some, but I mean, what is IHRC's role within these? I mean, what would you be doing that you're doing that tries to overcome these challenges? I mean, perhaps you can elaborate on those.
One of the things we've tried to do, and it's becoming a kind of lonely exercise, is not to give so much credence to the attacks. Now, by this, I mean, for example, oftentimes when an aggressive newspaper person will contact us, we will ask them to send their questions in writing. You don't have to explain yourself. I mean, this is something we try and tell other organizations, not when the questions are stupid, okay? Not when they are set to really just clearly antagonize you or demonize you. So, for example, not this particular incident, this is now going back about less than 20 years. I remember I was pregnant with my son, so he's 18. I remember it was Eid, getting a set of questions from someone, one of which said, what do you say to people who say you're using the language of a human rights organization to disguise your agenda? I said, well, we just wrote, well, maybe if we use the language of human rights, it means we're a human rights organization, right? You don't have to answer and say, oh, no, we're not. We haven't got a secret agenda. You can be as flip back to them. I don't think you have to be scared. However, and I mean, ultimately, he couldn't, and he didn't publish any response to that or try and engage with those types of questions that he had posed, because he properly got the stupid, the kind of, mind your own business answers that he deserved to his stupid questions. But ultimately, we are now in a situation, this is now 2 decades later, where Muslim civil society in particular is really battered. A lot of the leaders are quite afraid and scared, and they don't kind of have the courage to sort of stand up either individually or as part of a wider movement against these types of attacks. And that's why, unfortunately, whether it's against us or, as we saw, against Zara Mahmoud Muhammad, I forget her surname, who's now the leader of MCB, the kind of attacks she suffered very recently, that these attacks are becoming more frequent because there's less of a kind of confident response to them. So for our part, we continue to do that. We did that even with the Times.
Basically, educate the community.
Yeah, we need to educate ourselves.
Both
we need to have
Muslim
more
and
confidence.
non-Muslim, I mean, yeah.
The non-Muslim community, I mean, they are kind of getting, insofar as there is such a thing as a non-Muslim community. I mean, actually, it's many, many communities that broadly form a kind of majority society, are ultimately being fed information by a media and a political class that is becoming more narrow in its echelons in terms of its political views. And those views attack not just Muslims, not just other minoritized communities, but all sorts of justice movements for a variety of reasons. I don't even need to kind of elaborate. We've had so many corruption scandals come to light in the UK in the last year or so due to, I think, a long overdue light being shone on governance issues in this country that, the coronavirus pandemic brought to the forefront. We can see now that, there's something very rotten at the core of the liberal democratic state that we supposedly live in, and that needs to be looked at across the board. And all these kind of attacks, whether it's on Islamic Human Rights Commission or Muslim Council of Britain or the 1990 Trust, which wasn't a Muslim organization, but was very much demonized as well about 10 years ago, and all sorts of problems created for its trustees and so on. And the many other people who are demonized, Jeremy Corbyn, this one, that one, the other one. This is kind of masking a kind of the deeper problems that we have in society that we all need to be pitching in to look at. And everyone's got something to bring to that conversation.
Thanks, yeah. Okay. Now, coming to your publication, I've read some of your publications on Islamophobia and British Muslim identity. And also, I am aware of your recent publication, Environment of Hate, the New Normal for Muslims in the UK and Europe. I mean, these are novel work. How has this work been received by wider academia, politicians, as well as other human rights organizations?
So I think that particularly in academia, there's quite a good response. And the Environment of Hate, the New Normal for Muslims in the UK actually became a foundational text for a wider project across Europe that was actually funded by the European Commission, of which Ihrc was a part of that project with 5 other European universities between 2017 and 2018. And we looked at 8 different countries across Europe. So I think it's been kind of quite not just well received, but influential. Certainly it's had some backlash, particularly in Germany, where again, the issue of Palestine became centralized in attacks on Ihrc and Ihrc's involvement in the project. But that's now kind of par of the course. And I think a lot of people, whether they feel confident enough to stand up and make a public comment about it or not, understand that these are kind of the wider fault lines of justice activism that are unfolding. So it's kind of answering your previous question about types of attacks that we've had. We did go through quite a bit of backlash on this. We're still going through a bit of backlash on that. But at the same time, when you look at the wider context of Germany now, which was going through this kind of very regressive anti-Palestinian kind of discourse, has now been sort of turning a corner. You see things like the release of the Humboldt 3, you have the letter written about the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism by a few hundred academic and artistic leading figures in Germany. And you see that actually these things all form part of a wider to and fro movement. I think, as you emphasized before, it's about educating the Muslim community, whether it's the Khojas or any other part of them, to be involved in that, to be part of the wider picture, albeit that, we are under severe pressure and a lot of threats and attacks that we should justifiably be worried about.
Let me just stop you there. Then how is IHRC received in the Muslim community generally? You just mentioned that education of, you mentioned Khoja community, but we are just one of a very small community, a number of other Shia Muslim communities. So how are you received generally?
Well, I think
within the Muslim community now.
To make a very British kind of analogy, we're like Marmite. You either love us or hate us. I could not give you a.
But do you get the support you deserve? And if not, why not? What is your analysis?
So I don't know how much support we deserve. I think certainly, just generally, Muslim civil society has become more reticent, more afraid, less likely to want to upset the apple cart. And that obviously impacts on organizations like IHRC, who are trying to sort of push the boat out, who are sort of putting forward ideas that are usually if not controversial, they are not everyone's cup of tea. But I think it's not just about IHRC. I think it's about Muslim. When I say civil society, I mean the leadership of organizations. I don't mean grassroots Muslims, because I think as much as as Muslims, we should be self-critical on an individual level. Of course we should. That's what our faith demands of us. Ultimately, we're in very difficult times, and I can really understand why people would be scared on an individual level to stand up, speak out, do things, say things. My criticism is really for those people who put themselves in leadership positions, who want to be leaders of the community. And they have a right to feel under pressure, scared, pressurized. But if you're going to put yourself in a leadership position, you do need to have a little bit more guts. I think you have to be a bit braver and, stand up for what is right. And I think this is a general crisis across the Muslim community. And I don't even want to absolve IHRC from those criticisms. We should be self-reflective as well. But I do think it's becoming lonelier for organizations like IHRC to sort of stand up and say critical things, particularly when talking to government. So I tend to find that
that's what I
what
mean.
we used to laugh about when we were growing up.
From the leadership point of view, the Muslim leaders who are, say, in UK or in fact Europe, I mean, they're negotiating from a diverse viewpoints that are available to them. I mean, IHRC is one of them, as one of the voice for the Muslims, but there are other voices who also represent the Muslims, and the leadership have to negotiate within this diverse opinions and judgments and all that.
Well, we've never
they
said we're
also, if I may, they
organization.
also have a community which is very diverse in its approach as well. So, I mean, I can see the challenge. I can also see the challenge from the leadership point of view. And I think we need to somehow get together and get our house in order.
So if I can break that down a little bit.
And have the maturity to understand that there are diverse points of views to negotiate, but also come to a consensus that what is the best way to move forward. And I think in many ways, we find that the leadership consensus breaks down. Every organization deals in a way that it sees the best way to deal with the challenges. And here we are. We are where we are.
I think you've hit the nail on the head when you talk about maturity. And I think it's one of the great ironies that, 3, 4, 5, however many generations down the line we are of communities in this country or in westernized settings, we seem to be getting more immature as opposed to mature. And all these issues you mentioned about consensus are pretty much the crux of the issue. I mean, just to clarify, we've never said, and we don't put ourselves out to be a representative organization, albeit that actually one of the unique things about IHRC is that people who work within IHRC and within its network come from very, very diverse, both fiqh and ethnic backgrounds, and not simply based in the UK either. And I think that is fairly unique amongst Muslim civil society generally. But we do have certain specializations. And I mean, for example, I think it's one of the ironies that, albeit with all the kind of controversies that have been generated, this is often recognized by, for example, the European Commission, or even at times by the British government. I mean, as much as we're very critical about blindly working with governments, we've also had members of our organization who've sat on specialist committees that have been overseen, for example, by the Home Office. It's not a kind of...
I just want to confine the discussion on Muslims. Let me just ask you something else here, because before I forget it. So while we are all sort of Muslim, it is obvious that Shia and Sunni Muslims have their own distinct identity. I mean, this is fact. And then at times we have sectarian tensions as well with each other. So what is IHRC's approach towards Shia and Sunni relations, and what challenges do you feel both sects face currently? I mean, if we can just confine our discussion to this aspect of IHRC work.
So, I mean, as I mentioned, we are internally a very diverse organization. So in a way, that's kind of always been a model for us. How is it that we can work as people from Sunni Shia backgrounds for a greater cause, right? So in some ways, we've been immunized from that. At the same time, we're obviously quite aware of it. And it's one of the great ironies that we're often accused of being a Shia or pro-Shia organization by everyone except for Shias, who often accuse us of being pro-Salafi, pro-Wahhabi, pro-this, pro-that, pro-Sunni. You know, it's
that's all very unusual. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, it's and I actually think that's probably, you know, if there's any sign that we might be doing something right, then that probably is it. But just from a practical point of view, we have, particularly in the last decade, worked on conflict resolution projects specifically on this issue. And we've done it a little bit in the UK, but we've done it more in Pakistan and Indonesia and other country contexts. And it's hard going, but it is doable and does have tangible results. But ultimately, you know, it can't, as with everything, it can't just be one small or medium-sized NGO trying to just change the whole world. It needs purchase across the board. And what we've seen is that we have allowed ourselves, whether we're Shias or Sunnis or the different facets within those Shia and Sunni identities, because they're not block identities either, to be instrumentalized by the governments of the countries that we live in, to fight each other rather than to look for.
I think that a lot of work needs to be done within ourselves, although we can attach blame to the others, but it's only because of our weakness that they're able to. So I think
we have internalized it. We have internalized.
Fundamentally, I think, particularly at least in the European Muslims, or at least United Kingdom Muslims, surely it is not beyond our wits to come together, facing the challenges together. I mean, it's not beyond our wits, but somehow we allow ourselves to be in that position of vulnerability.
Well, as you said, it can't be beyond our wits, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has told us that, you know, the future is there to be fought for in a certain way and in certain ways. And yet, you're right, this is where there is real proper critique to be had, that we cannot somehow negotiate these differences. And if anything, things have been getting worse. They haven't been getting better. And this is not to absolve Muslims of the responsibility for it. But it is ultimately a thing about how the leadership of our community has internalized what are effectively Islamophobic narratives, the same narratives that say, well, Muslims are a problem because X, Y, Z. We have internalized those. So what we start doing is go, well, it's not us, it's those Muslims over there who are the problem. They're the extremists, they're the fundamentalists, they're the fanatics, they're the terrorists, and we have a whole long list, which is the same long list that's used about all Muslims. And we just project it elsewhere. This doesn't mean that there are no problems in the Muslim community, or we don't have, you know, this, that, or the other thing to deal with. But what it does mean is that actually we are allowing ourselves to be problematized and then divided according to those problems. And, you know, we're coming from a British context. This is classic British divide and rule, right? How is it we still can't see through this? You know, I mean, there's a point when it just becomes
laughable. We should be able to see through that fog, surely. Okay, Arzu, I've got last three questions. What do you feel are Islamic human rights' major accomplishments?
It's a good question. I'll be honest with you, I think depending who you ask in the organization, they'll all give something different. So I don't want to say anything that's definitive. From my own point of view, the things that I've been really honored to be involved in were things like the release of prisoners. I think it's often an overlooked thing. And although I'm not really so much involved in that campaign side anymore, advocacy side, certainly in the early days, there were a lot of people that the mainstream human rights organizations just didn't want to touch their cases because they involved quote unquote Islamists and things like this. People who,
say it again. What did you say?
Quote unquote Islamists. You know, this is kind of used as a pejorative term. So people many of the people who were imprisoned in Turkey during the soft coup and even subsequently, who've been released as a result of the campaigns and activisms, not just of the organization of IHRC, but the kind of worldwide network of campaigners who sort of follow the work, who would have written campaign emails and letters and kind of held protests. Of course, when we started, Sheikh Ibrahim Zakzaki was in prison at that time, and many hundreds of people from the Islamic movement. And at that time, it took a few years, but alhamdulillah, they were released. That type of thing has been really, it's not the kind of, it's often forgotten, that work, but that type of work is I think it changed the landscape of human rights sector, because, you know, mainstream organizations realized that they had to engage. They couldn't just pick and choose who they were advocating for, you know, that they couldn't just allow the kind of prejudices that existed
Do you think
to compromise their beliefs.
Do you think IHRC has made an impression in the last 20 years? More than
24
20
years. It's getting on for 24
so
years.
the perception in, say, late 90s and early 21st century, now the perception is much more that IHRC is also one of the mainstream, would you say, advocacy organization?
I think we are. I think we're much more mainstream than
so that's a,
often give us
a
credit
good
for.
change. That's a
It
good
is,
change.
but I think what's more important is that by doing what we did, we were able to create space for other organizations. You know, everybody doesn't have to be IHRC.
No, I understand what I'm
Identities.
trying to say to you is that having put Islamic name in there, that I mean, it's nice to see that is a mainstream organization, and that people do engage with you, thinking that you do fight for Muslim rights. Supposedly those rights are not catered for in the fullest sense of the word rights in the UK, and that you will come in and then see that those rights are properly ascribed to the community who are part and parcel of the British society.
It is. I just want to sort of just not sorry to cut you off, but you know, we don't just fight for Muslim rights. Yes,
No, I understand
ultimately,
that.
in terms of the day-to-day work, the majority of it is for Muslims and issues like Islamophobia. But you know, with the Islamic Human Rights Commission, we fight for everyone with that sense of.
Yeah, I mean, I'm talking about the name now. You know, Islamophobia, Islamic human rights. I mean, there's a contentions there, and even within that sort of contradictions, Islamophobia and then Islamic, not contradiction, but in the sense that you have to negotiate through that Islamic phobic thinking the objectives of Islamic human rights as a commission. It is, I mean, enlightening to see that the Islamic human rights have become an organization that others would engage to discuss Muslim rights. Now, I understand that you don't only fight for Muslim rights, but I think the basis for one of the factor, I'm sure, is that Muslim rights generally, from say United Nations downwards, needed to be brought forward. That these rights are not properly entrenched in the discussion, and I think one of the things that you were trying to do was to make sure that the perspective of Muslims are also in the equation of discussions that we are going to have.
Yeah,
and it's nice to see that after 20 years that there is that way that you have created. That's what I'm trying to say. Do you think that is correct analysis?
I think so. And I think something that we found along the way as well is that actually we don't always have to have the conversation with westernized institutions, and particularly in the project to talk about what are rights, whether they're Islamic, you frame them as Islamic human rights or something more universal. We found that there's a whole world of partners, you know, whether it's liberation theologists from South America, whether it's, you know, academics and activists in India or Malaysia or elsewhere, even China and so on, who are very engaged on these topics from their own traditions, and also from quote unquote other Muslim traditions as well. And that was the sort of, if you like, the big project of Islamic human rights. How do we then visualize that? So It's very kind of you to say many of the things that you have about the achievements of IHRC, and inshallah, I hope they are true, and I hope if they're not true,
no, I just took on from what you discussed, the achievements, and I thought that if that is the perception that you have created over 20 years, and now beginning to engage with other organizations with similar sort of objectives, just mentioned just now, I think that that's engaging, that's discussing, and moving forward together. And that is the universality of it. And this is where, for example, a perspective needs to be looked at, as a perspective from the Americans need to be looked at, the liberation aspect of it, and others as well. And when you come to sort of negotiate a way forward together with a similar objective in mind, and that's engagement. And I think, so if anyone wants to work or volunteer with IHRC, because many people would be wanting to after this conversation, hopefully, what type of attitude and traits are you looking for then in a person who wants to work with you? Would you say someone fundamentally must be an activist for Muslim causes or fighting against oppression of Muslims? Or generally, the passion is that where, for example, there's injustice, you'd like to put a voice across that is wrong?
There's many different ways of engaging, because alhamdulillah, there are different sort of types and sections and departments of work. So however you imagine yourself on your journey with regard to this, if you're interested, I would just encourage people to contact us, because we have a very academic side where people can get involved in research projects. We have roles to do with just campaigning, not just campaigning, but campaigning, which is in a way separate from the academic work. We have many ways you can do that. You could just be sharing things on social media, or you could be actually writing letters, emails, or encouraging other people to do so. Point of contact, go through our website or email us info@ihrc.org, or the website is www.ihrc.org or .org.uk, if you whichever you prefer to go by. We have, we're on Twitter, Facebook, all the rest of it, so you can find us there as well. Just drop us a line. There's always ways that you can interact in lesser or greater extent.
Sure. Yeah. But I just wanted a general picture from you. Now, the last question, in the light of almost more than 20 years of experience or the existence of IHRC, in the light of those experiences that you've had, what is the future vision of Islamic Human Rights Commission? How do you sort of see you moving forward?
See, this is now a question for the whole management team of IHRC, of which I'm on sabbatical for this year. So I feel a little bit. My view is that inshallah IHRC will continue to push the boundaries, really, and particularly that focus on now looking at what is that bigger conversation. Okay, how do we?
Sorry.
What is the bigger conversation? Going back to that original phrase, the grammars of human dignity. How do we now start making that a discussion with meaning, with bite, and something of a reality? One of the people we work with quite extensively, Professor Ramon Grossfogel, highlights that actually we're in a very critical moment of the world, because the world is being, if you like, we're in a globalized context, which is imbued with this a westernized civilization, which is ultimately a civilization of death. It's not just about the wars, it's about the environmental degradation, it's about the increasing gaps between rich and poor. I mean, these are the very big questions, and they can't be solved using the same language that's creating those problems. Okay, so as much as the vast majority of the world is disenfranchised from power, we need to find a way of turning that disenfranchisement into movements that will ultimately save the human race. Okay, and as believers, as opposed to Muslims by identity, we have an important role to play in this. We really have to open our minds and open the conversation in a way that's, inshallah, when we are all held to account, we will pass, inshallah.
Yeah, one last question. This emerges from our discussion just now. We now have, obviously, a settled British Muslim presence. We consider we are part and parcel of a British society and identify, at least trying to identify ourselves as British Muslims, or even English Muslims, Welsh Muslims, Scottish Muslims, however people want to identify themselves. And they're creating their own sort of identity in that sense, or negotiating with it. So as a settled Muslim presence here in UK, given the circumstances of what we've just gone through, pandemic, Brexit, your own sort of work on Islamophobia, the Islamophobic perceptions, how do you see the settled British presence which is here, considering themselves as British citizens? What sort of role should they play? A constructive role to make the society more harmonious and contented.
I think we have a few issues.
I want a positive, constructive now to see, well, what can we do as a British Muslim community, part of the British society, and want to make a contribution?
I think we shouldn't underestimate the huge contribution we're already making. Mm-hmm. And I say that with a full understanding of all the shortcomings that we've just been talking about. But, you know, whether you're a passport holder or not, and it's becoming increasingly difficult in this day and age to be one, regardless of how many years you've lived here or even if you were born here. We're in every facet of society, whether it's bus drivers, doctors, lecturers, we're everywhere, right? The key workers, the taxi drivers, everybody has a role, is playing a role, okay? And the problems that beset British society, and I think this is key, that I think British Muslims or Muslims in the UK need to let go of the idea the problem of disharmony is somehow related to them, and look at the wider picture, okay? The things that are keeping us apart are things like Islamophobia, which are not the result of Muslims' behavior, but because of demonized narratives, which are basically exploited by the powerful to distract from the kind of injustices that they're perpetrating on society. So as Muslims, please be, I would say, as a message, please be confident about your existence, okay? Yes, there are many problems and Muslims are not perfect, but we are not the cause of social disharmony. If anything, it's the institutions around us that either deliberately, but more often not knowingly, reproduce the problems that we're all encountering. And we need to have, as a next step, those of us who have competency or feel they want to tackle it, we need to be addressing the problems there. But, you know, mashallah, I think British Muslims or Muslims in the UK, however you want to talk about them, us, you're doing a lot already. And, you know, it's not on every individual to solve those problems.
Yeah, sure. And I think that every individual take the responsibility and make sure that they fulfill those responsibilities. Where there is injustices, to speak out as well, confidently. Also, I think taken a lot of your time, 1 hour almost. So I think I hope that we've done justice to the subject matter that we discussed. So I think we will end here. And lastly, thank you very much coming and sharing your journey of life, as well as your passion, if I can put it like that, your passion for justice, and the instrumentality that you want to use human rights within the housing of human dignity. I think that's a very nice way of moving forward. Thank you very much for sharing all those ideas with us, and hope that IHRC develops its vision in the way its management now wants to go forward in the light of the experiences that we've had over the past 20 years. And I hope that it will all be very positive, and the Muslim community will also look at the work of IHRC in the context of the times we were living in. Thank you very much indeed, Arzu, for sharing with us all those experiences.
Thank you so much for the time
Okay.
and all your kind words. Thank you.
Thank you very much.